Story number 1. My mother had a weakness for dainty china and finger sandwiches, which is how our trips to Victoria's tea room became a monthly tradition. The shop sat in a converted Victorian house 40 miles outside the city, its white trim and lavender shutters perfectly matching its delicate interior of lace doilies and flowered wallpaper. My grandmother would join us, completing our little group of 3 generations of women sharing Earl Grey and scones in the carefully renovated dining room. The elderly owner, Mrs. Harrison, served us herself, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her measuring spoons clicking against porcelain as she prepared each pot with precise movements. The sound became a familiar rhythm, 3 gentle taps for each measuring spoon of loose tea leaves, followed by the soft whisper of hot water being poured. Looking back, I know there's probably a rational explanation for everything that happened, but I can't shake the memory of those measuring spoons and their methodical tapping. The first sign something was wrong came during the drive home. My mother's cell phone rang just as we passed the county line at 3:07 p.m. The call informed us that my other grandmother, my father's mother, had passed away. We'd known it was coming. The cancer had spread aggressively in her final months. Still, the timing felt strange, receiving the news just as we were returning from our peaceful afternoon, the taste of lavender cookies still lingering on our tongues. 2 months later, we returned to Victoria's. Everything appeared identical. The same tinkling bell above the door, the same fresh flowers on each table, even the same soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. Mrs. Harrison remembered our usual orders, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she measured the tea. The scones were perfectly crushed that day, served with clotted cream and house-made strawberry preserves that caught the afternoon light like rubies. The phone rang at exactly 3:07 p.m. as we crossed the county line. This time, it was about my Uncle Richard. A massive heart attack, completely unexpected. He'd been found in his garage, tools scattered around his restored Mustang. The coincidence sent a chill through me, but I pushed the thought aside. After all, what could a quaint tea shop possibly have to do with death? Uncle Richard had been having heart problems for years, even if he didn't talk about them much. The doctors had warned him about his blood pressure, his cholesterol, his refusal to take his medication regularly. When Mother suggested returning to Victoria's 3 months later, I hesitated, but the rational part of my brain won out. There was no logical connection between our tea outings and family deaths. Both had been elderly relatives with documented health issues. The weather had turned cool, and the shop's interior felt especially cozy. I watched Mrs. Harrison's shaking hands as she measured the tea leaves, 3 taps of the spoon for each pot. The china clinked with an almost musical precision. Her hands shook more noticeably now, and I caught her watching our table with an unreadable expression between servings. I found myself studying every detail of the room that day, the slight discoloration in the wallpaper where water damage had been repaired, the way the grandfather clock in the corner ticked just slightly off rhythm, the small collection of antique measuring spoons mounted on the wall behind the service counter. Each set had 3 spoons, all lined up in perfect rows, their silver surfaces reflecting the afternoon light like watching eyes. I watched the clock during our drive home. As we approached the county line, my palms began to sweat. Right on schedule at 3:07 p.m., Mother's phone lit up. My grandfather's brother had died peacefully in his sleep. He was 87, had been on dialysis for years, and his death wasn't unexpected. But the timing, that exact same moment on the drive home, that same stretch of road, that same minute on the clock, made my skin crawl. The rational part of my mind reminded me that elderly people die all the time, that coincidences happen, that patterns emerge from random events simply because humans are wired to seek them out. The following week, we drove past Victoria's to find the windows dark, a for sale sign swaying in the front garden. Through grimy windows, I could see Mrs. Harrison's measuring spoons still hanging on their brass hooks, catching the afternoon light. 3 spoons, 3 deaths, 3 calls at 3:07 p.m. The deaths all had perfectly logical explanations: age, illness, documented health conditions. But whenever I think about those measuring spoons tapping out their precise rhythm, I can't help but wonder what else they were counting besides tea leaves. Story number 2. Back in high school, My friend Sarah and I used to explore abandoned buildings whenever we could. It was stupid, but we thought we were invincible like most teenagers. We had this whole routine. We'd pack flashlights, make sure our phones were charged, and tell each other where to meet if we got separated. Looking back, it probably wasn't the smartest hobby, but we'd explored maybe a dozen old houses and barns without anything weird happening. This one time in February, we decided to check out this old farmstead that had been empty for years. Sarah had heard about it from her older brother, who said it was completely abandoned. It was just this cluster of rundown buildings around a big barn, connected to the main road by this long gravel driveway. The property had 3 or 4 smaller buildings, looked like old equipment sheds and maybe a chicken coop, but the barn dominated everything. We parked my old Civic at the entrance of the driveway, figuring it would be better to walk in and have an easy escape route. It had snowed the night before, so everything was really quiet and still. The snow wasn't deep, maybe 3 inches, but it made the whole place feel isolated. We could see our breath in the cold air as we walked up the driveway, checking out the smaller buildings first. Most were empty except for some old tools and fallen roof beams. The barn was the biggest building, so we headed there last. The doors were kind of broken, hanging off their hinges, and we had to squeeze through to get inside. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as we entered. Sarah was using her phone as a flashlight, and I had this cheap dollar store flashlight that barely worked. The beams kept catching dust particles in the air, which made everything feel hazy. That's when we found the weird stuff. Right in the middle of the barn floor was this perfect circle made of deer bones. Like someone had carefully placed each bone around this deer skull in the center. It wasn't scattered or messy like if animals had dragged them there. It was deliberately arranged. What made it creepier was that the bones looked clean, not old and weathered like you'd expect. In the corner, there were these blankets stacked up really neatly with a pile of firewood. The blankets looked clean too, which meant someone had been there recently. There were some empty food wrappers nearby, but they weren't scattered. They were stacked in a neat pile. Sarah and I just looked at each other and knew we needed to get out of there. We didn't even talk about it, just started backing toward the door. The barn had this weird smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of like wet metal and something else I couldn't identify. As we squeezed back through the doors, I swear I heard something move in the hayloft above us, but I didn't want to stick around to check. We started walking back down the gravel road toward my car, trying to act normal even though we were both freaked out. The snow had started melting in patches where the sun hit it, creating these puddles of slush. That's when we heard it, this horrible screeching sound behind us. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. Then we heard footsteps on the gravel, heavy ones, coming toward us fast. Each crunch seemed to echo in the cold air. We ran for it. The footsteps behind us got faster too, and the screeching just got louder. It sounded almost human but wrong somehow, like someone trying to imitate a scream but not quite getting it right. When we reached my car, I dropped my keys in the snow because my hands were shaking so bad. The metal was so cold it burned my fingers as I picked them up. Once I got them, the car started fine, but the back wheels were stuck in this puddle of melted snow. Sarah was absolutely losing it beside me, screaming and covering her ears, refusing to look back while I kept trying to get the car unstuck. Every time I pressed the gas, the wheels would just spin and spray slush behind us. The footsteps were getting closer and closer. I could hear them right behind us when the wheels finally caught and we shot forward. Sarah finally turned around to look, but there was nothing there, just the empty road. When we looked at the snow, there were only our footprints from walking to and from the barn. No other tracks at all. I know it could have been the wind, or some weird animal, or our imaginations running wild, but both of us are absolutely certain someone, or something, was following us that day. I seriously thought we were going to die. I drive a different route now just to avoid that road, and Sarah says she's never gone exploring abandoned places since. Story number 3, I lived in a small townhouse with my mother and my German Shepherd, Maya, in a quiet development just outside the city. The place wasn't fancy, basic beige siding, small patch of lawn out front, shared wall with neighbors we rarely saw, but it was home. Maya and I had our routine down perfect after 3 years there. She'd patrol the perimeter every morning and evening, checking her usual spots while I got ready for my warehouse job or wound down after my shift. One Tuesday in September started like any other. I came home around 6, dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, a habit my mom had drilled into me, and started my evening routine. Maya followed me upstairs while I changed out of my work clothes, then back down to the kitchen. The click of her nails on the linoleum kept me company while I started dinner. Just a basic pasta with sauce since I was too tired for anything fancy. When the food was ready, I headed upstairs to get my mom. Our bedrooms faced each other across the narrow hallway on the second floor, with a shared bathroom between them. A trace of cigarette smoke drifted from under her door when I knocked. She grunted in response, at least I thought she did, so I went back downstairs to eat alone. I saved her a plate, covered it with plastic wrap, and left it in the microwave like always. That night, Maya took her usual spot at the foot of my bed. She'd slept there every night since she was a puppy, never anywhere else. I double-checked my bedroom door was locked, a habit from our previous apartment in a rougher part of town, before climbing under the covers. The house settled into its familiar nighttime sounds. The hum of the heating system, the tick of Maya's collar when she scratched, the distant sound of cars on the highway, the occasional creak of the shared wall. Something woke me around 2 a.m. Not a sound, but a sensation. Someone was holding my hand, gently shaking it like my mom used to do when I was little and wouldn't wake up for school. My eyes snapped open, heart suddenly pounding. The room was dark except for the green glow of my alarm clock. Empty, but Maya wasn't on the bed. She's always on my bed. She hasn't slept anywhere else in 7 years. Then I heard the scratching at my bedroom door. Urgent, panicked scratching, accompanied by Maya's low whine. But that was impossible. The door was locked from the inside. I always lock it. Always. The scratching grew more frantic, and I could hear her pacing back and forth in the hallway. The cigarette smoke smell was stronger now, though no one in our family smoked. None of our neighbors smoked either. It was against the lease agreement. My hands shook as I got out of bed. 3 steps to the door, 2 steps, 1. I turned the lock and Maya burst in, hackles raised, immediately beginning a systematic search of my room. She checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains, just like she'd been trained. "Mom?" I called out. No answer. The smoke smell led me down the hallway. Maya pressed against my leg. "Mom!" Louder this time. Still nothing. Her door was closed, but when I knocked there was only silence. The handle turned easily under my palm. Her bed was made, hospital corners neat and tight like she always did them. The TV was off, the room dark and cold. No one had been in here for hours. Maya sniffed every corner while I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 2:17 a.m. in steady red pulses. We searched the entire house. Every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. I checked the garage. Her car wasn't there. All the doors were locked. Every window was secured with no sign of tampering. Nothing was disturbed, nothing was missing, but I could still smell that cigarette smoke, stronger in some rooms than others, like someone had been walking through the house. The next morning, my hands still shaking, I called my mom's cell. "Oh, honey," she said, "I left yesterday morning to drive up to Grandpa's. He took a bad turn, and I wanted to be there. Didn't you get my note?" There was no note. I checked the kitchen counter again, the fridge door, the table by the front door. Nothing. But there, in the microwave, was the plate of pasta I'd saved the night before, for someone who hadn't been home at all. Maya refused to leave my side for the next week. She kept positioning herself between me and my mother's empty room, growling at nothing I could see. But now I keep my bedroom door unlocked, just in case my dog needs to get to me quickly. Story number 4, I've always been interested in occult literature, mostly for creative writing inspiration. Last spring, I decided to read the Ars Goetia, figuring it would give me some interesting ideas for a short story. Nothing serious, just research, or so I thought. I kept the book on my desk, making notes about the various demons and hierarchies described in its pages. About a week after I started reading it, I began hearing this strange jingling sound outside my bedroom window late at night. It would usually start around 2 or 3 a.m., this delicate musical sound that seemed to come from somewhere in the darkness. I checked our backyard thoroughly. No wind chimes, no loose metal objects. Nothing that could explain it. Our neighbors didn't have anything hanging in their yards either. The sound would last for maybe 5 minutes, then stop as suddenly as it started. The first really unsettling thing happened on a Tuesday morning. I walked into the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. My grandfather's painting, a landscape he'd painted before he passed away, was hanging upside down on the wall. I lived with my husband at the time, but he'd already left for work. The painting had been properly oriented when we went to bed the night before. I was certain of it because I'd been admiring it while watching TV. I put the painting back right side up, trying to rationalize how it could have flipped. The hook was sturdy, the wire secure. It would have taken deliberate effort to turn it upside down. I checked all our doors and windows, but everything was locked tight. A few days later, I walked into the kitchen and found all the knives in our knife block inserted handle down. Every single one perfectly reversed. Then the garbage can in the bathroom was backwards, facing the wall instead of out toward the room. Little things kept happening. Books rearranged on shelves, coffee mugs turned so all the handles faced left instead of right. The shower curtain hung inside out. That weekend, something even stranger occurred. I woke up early to do laundry and found every single frame photo in our hallway had been turned completely backward. Not just a few of them, every single one. There were 12 photos in total, arranged in a neat gallery wall going up our staircase. Each frame was facing the wall instead of showing the photos, but they were still hanging perfectly straight on their hooks. The weird part was the dust patterns. There were no marks or smudges to show they'd been handled recently. The thin layer of dust on each frame was completely undisturbed. I spent almost an hour checking each frame for loose hardware or tilted hooks, anything that could explain how they all flipped without being touched. Nothing. Just like with the painting, they were all securely mounted. It would have taken someone deliberately turning each one to get them exactly backward like that. I took photos on my phone before turning them right side up again, half expecting them to flip back on their own. The jingling continued every few nights. I started recording it on my phone, trying to figure out its pattern or source. That's when I noticed it seemed to happen more often when the wind was blowing from a certain direction. After some investigation and asking around the neighborhood, I discovered there was an archdiocese about half a mile away. Their bell tower had some loose decorative pieces that would chime in strong winds. Mystery solved, at least that part of it. The other incidents kept escalating until I finally broke down and told my husband how freaked out I was getting. He started laughing, then looked guilty and confessed. After seeing how rattled I was by the painting incident, he decided to play into my interest in creepy things by creating more weird occurrences. He was the one who'd flipped the knives, turned the garbage can, and rearranged various items around the house. He thought I'd figure it out, and we'd both get a laugh out of it. I was relieved to have an explanation for most of the strange happenings, but two things still bother me. When my husband confessed, I asked him about the painting and the gallery wall photos. His smile faded, and he swore he hadn't touched either of them. He pointed out that he wouldn't have started with something so meaningful. He knew how much my grandfather's painting meant to me. That's why he'd waited until after the painting incident to start his pranks. Plus, he'd been out of town the weekend all the photos turned around. We've moved twice since then. I still have the painting and those family photos, and nothing's turned upside down again. I got rid of the Ars Goetia though, just in case. Story number 5. Video games were our escape during summer breaks, and my brother and I would often stay up well past midnight playing whatever new game we'd managed to save up for. That particular night, we were deep into Final Fantasy VII, taking turns controlling Cloud through the reactor mission. Our parents had long since gone to bed, leaving us to our usual weekend routine of energy drinks and endless battles. The layout of our house was pretty simple. A long hallway led from the living room where we played games, past the kitchen on the right, then down to our bedrooms. My room was at the very end, my brother's right next to mine. The kitchen had this old linoleum flooring that amplified every footstep, while the rest of the house was carpeted. The laundry room connected to the kitchen, and next to that was the basement door, this heavy wooden thing that always stuck in humid weather. We had our late-night gaming routine down to a science. The TV volume just loud enough to hear but not wake our parents, a strategic pillow placed under the door to muffle any sound. Empty Mountain Dew cans lined up on the coffee table like trophies of our determination to stay awake. We knew every creak in the house by heart, which floorboards to avoid when sneaking to the bathroom, how to open the fridge without making that weird squeaking sound, even which way the AC would make the door swing when it kicked on. At night, our house had its own rhythm of familiar sounds that became background noise to our gaming sessions. It must have been around 3 a.m. when we decided to call it quits. We'd made it through a particularly tough boss fight and figured it was a good place to stop. Our eyes were burning from staring at the TV screen for hours, and even the caffeine from our third Mountain Dew couldn't keep us going anymore. We saved our game, clicked off the console, and started gathering up our controllers and snack wrappers. The house was completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional crack of the house settling. That's when we heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the kitchen. The sound was unmistakable on that old linoleum. A slow, methodical thud, thud, thud. My brother and I froze, controllers still in hand, and looked at each other. The steps were too heavy to be our mom's, and they had none of our dad's familiar shuffle. They sounded like someone was trying to walk quietly, but didn't know where the creaky spots were. "Dad!" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The footsteps immediately stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then they started again, slower this time, moving away from us toward the laundry room. The sound changed as they moved from linoleum to the laundry room's concrete floor, becoming more muffled, but still distinctly there. Then nothing, just silence and darkness at the end of the hallway. We must have looked ridiculous, two teenage boys suddenly scrambling and yelling for our parents like little kids afraid of the dark. But something about those footsteps, the deliberate way they moved, the way they responded to my voice, it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Our parents came running, Dad in his boxers and Mom in her nightgown, both looking confused and concerned. We tried explaining what we'd heard, talking over each other in our rush to get the story out. Dad grabbed the baseball bat he kept by their bed and went to investigate, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing was disturbed. The basement door was still locked, its old deadbolt firmly in place. All the windows were secure, no signs of forced entry. The kitchen floor was empty, not even a chair out of place. Dad even checked the basement itself, though that door hadn't been opened in weeks judging by the dust on the handle. We slept with our lights on that night, both of us too freaked out to even try darkness. The next morning, Dad did another thorough check of the house in daylight. He tested all the floorboards in the kitchen, thinking maybe it was just the house settling in a weird way. But that linoleum had a distinctive sound. You couldn't mistake it for anything else. Of course, there are logical explanations. Could have been a burglar who got spooked when I called out, though they would have had to move impossibly fast to escape before Dad's search. Could have been some weird acoustical effect making normal house sounds seem like footsteps. Could have been our caffeine-wired brains playing tricks on us after hours of gaming. My brother and I still debate it sometimes when we get together. He thinks it was probably someone who broke in and managed to hide somewhere we didn't check. I'm not so sure. All I know is that those footsteps were real. Both of us heard them. Both of us remember exactly how they sounded, and neither of us ever stayed up that late gaming in the living room again. Story number 6. Late last summer when this all started, our front porch was my dog's favorite spot. He'd spend hours out there watching the neighborhood, sprawled in the sun or lounging on the old wooden bench between the fence posts. That changed after I found the first gift. It was one of those perfect days between August and September when I stepped out to water the plants and found a bizarre little bundle on our welcome mat. Fur, feathers, and hair all tangled together with a silver earring woven through it. I called my husband out to look, pointing at it while keeping my distance. "There's some weird juju shit on our porch," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. He examined it with that practical mindset husbands are good at. "Probably just something the neighbor's tomcat dragged over," he suggested. "Or maybe our dog found it." Our dog had never brought anything home before, but I latched onto these explanations. They were normal, better than thinking someone had deliberately left what looked like a ritual object on our doorstep. The dog wouldn't go near that spot for days after my husband removed the bundle. I started noticing him avoiding that section of the porch entirely, But life went on relatively normally for a few weeks. Then last week, I opened the front door and felt that same chill of wrongness. There, in exactly the same spot where the fur bundle had been, sat a pristine white-tailed deer mandible. The bone was completely intact, cleaned of flesh, sitting with an unnaturally precise alignment on our welcome mat. My husband again tried finding logical explanations. Maybe the dog found it in the woods. Maybe it was dragged there by an animal. But by now, our dog wouldn't set foot on the porch at all. When we let him out, he does his business quickly and runs straight back to the door. I started checking through the windows before stepping out, documenting everything on my phone. My husband installed a security camera under the eaves, but it keeps losing power despite being hardwired to our house electrical. We've checked the connections 3 times now. Yesterday, everything shifted. I was at my desk near the front door, studying for an exam, when our dog suddenly went from napping to full alert, barking and growling at the door. I looked up just in time to see someone on our porch, an elderly woman I'd never seen before, her gray hair wild and unkempt, her clothes hanging oddly on her thin frame. She moved with slow, deliberate steps toward our front door. My heart pounding, I watched through the window as she bent down, picked up the deer mandible, and carried it with reverent care to our porch bench. She positioned it with methodical precision between 2 fence posts, directly in a beam of sunlight that cut across the porch. The bone gleamed white in the light, looking almost like it was glowing. Then she turned and walked away, her movements as purposeful as when she arrived. I waited several minutes before looking out the door, half expecting the bone to be gone or transformed into something else. But there it sat on the bench, exactly as she'd placed it, catching the sunlight like some kind of ritual object. No pamphlet, no note, no explanation. This morning, the bone was facing a different direction, though my husband says it's just the changing angle of the sunlight playing tricks on me. The cameras stopped working again. Our dog won't even look at the porch anymore. He turns his head away when we pass the front windows. I'm writing everything down, taking photos, noting times and dates. The fur bundle with its silver earring, the bone's first appearance, and now this woman deliberately repositioning it in the sunlight. Someone is using our porch like some kind of altar, and something tells me they're not finished yet. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.